Part 1, Moorings in Spiritual Direction. The first 5 presentations of this series offer a general overview of spiritual direction. They focus on what spiritual direction is, its primary relationships, its integrating transformative function, its use of active listening, and its prayerful search for wisdom. By examining these essentials of this important ministry, they also hope to show how spiritual direction can become a place where the moral and spiritual dimensions of the Christian tradition can come together and find a home. In our first presentation, we will take a look at what spiritual direction is. Lecture 1. What is spiritual direction? Let us begin with a reading from Psalm 25. Make me know your ways, O Lord. Teach me your paths. Lead me in your truth and teach me, for you are the God of my salvation. For you I wait all day long. It is important for us to start with a common understanding of what the ministry of spiritual direction is all about. Although most of us have probably already heard of spiritual direction, it is quite possible that some of us, even those with much experience in pastoral care, cannot have a very clear idea of what it is or exactly what to expect from it. In this presentation, we will present the bare bones of this important ministry in the church and provide a general sense of what might take place during a typical session. So what is spiritual direction? It is known by a number of various other titles today: spiritual guidance. It's also called spiritual accompaniment. But spiritual direction is a helping relationship that focuses on growth in our relationship with God. Now, a person may seek spiritual direction for any number of reasons: a deep awareness of one's sinfulness and not knowing how to deal with it, being stuck in one's efforts to grow in holiness, examining one's relationships in the light of one's faith, wanting to draw closer to God through prayer, discerning God's will in one's life, to name but a few. Direction can be directive or non-directive. When the director takes a prominent role in instructing us about what we must do to draw closer to God, then spiritual direction is directive. But when the director, by way of contrast, employs careful listening and honest personal feedback to help us discover for ourselves the next steps that we need to take in our journey, then spiritual direction is called non-directive. Over time, each director will develop his or her own unique style of direction, sometimes incorporating elements of both the directive and non-directive approaches into something uniquely his or her own. Now, before entering into a relationship of spiritual direction, a director normally meets with the person seeking guidance in order to discuss expectations regarding such things as the specific kind of direction being offered, the frequency of meetings, the length of individual sessions, confidentiality, qualifications, and when appropriate, even payment. The primary focus of spiritual direction is our relationship with God. And a number of factors should always be kept in mind during a direction session. our understanding of ourselves, how we act towards others and the world in which we live, our relationship with God, and the quality of our prayer. During direction, we are not looking for abstract knowledge of these important dimensions of the spiritual life, but an experiential awareness of them. And from such practical existential knowledge, a number of important questions will come to the fore at some point during the direction process. How do we treat ourselves? How do we act towards others? How do we live in the world? How do we behave toward God? How do we pray? Although every relationship, indeed every session of spiritual direction is unique, a number of common threads often are woven into the relationship over time. And what follows is a general description of what a typical session of spiritual direction might be like. To a large extent, the quality of a direction session will be the function of the serious personal preparation that each of us has brought to it. Although the time allotted for private preparation will vary from person to person, I would say a minimum of 15 to 20 minutes for an examination of consciousness should be set aside at some point prior to each session. During this time, we look back on our lives to identify those encounters, events, and circumstances that have affected us most deeply and that we would like to explore during the direction session. This remote preparation on our part and that of the director will make the more immediate preparation at the outset of the session even more poignant. Now, the director normally opens a session by sitting with us in silence for a few minutes. And as we do so, we bow our heads, we assume a comfortable posture of prayer, and simply rest in the divine presence. And when we have become sufficiently recollected, we make brief acts of faith in God's presence, humility and contrition of heart, and a request for guidance. And these acts can be done either quietly or out loud. And from that initial period of silence, and remember, this silence should permeate the entire discussion, which is meant to be a holy conversation between two people, one person specifically trying to become himself or herself in the faith. We move from this initial period of silence with a backdrop of silence against the entire conversation and begin by looking at our lives. After this period of preparatory silence, the actual direction process itself begins. The director invites us to engage in a process of reflection over the events since our last meeting. And if we do not know where to begin, the director reassures us that one place is as good as any. The director helps us to reflect on the significance of the event through active listening, by finding connections with other things that have been shared, and by inviting us to look for God in the midst of these circumstances. And during this time, we are more or less unpacking our lives before the director and given the freedom to do so as we see fit. During this part of the process, the director exercises the discipline of active listening. Such listening normally has a freeing effect on us and helps us to delve more deeply into our experience, to sift through with special attention to what God might be trying to say to us through it. And the purpose of this active listening at this stage of the direction process is to allow our feelings to surface so that the deeper issues involved in our relationship with God may move from the periphery to the center of our awareness. And then as we reflect on our lives, we move to a deeper level where we then share our feelings with the director. And this is the time of the affective level. Now, we must first be in touch with our feelings and recognize them for what they are: sadness, hurt, anger, depression, courage, determination, joy. Many of us cannot bring our emotions to prayer to the fore because we are terribly out of touch with them. At this stage of the direction process, the director helps us to identify and express the various nuances of our experience. And if we find this difficult, the director helps us by suggesting a variety of possible emotional responses and then asking us to identify which comes closest to our experience. And in addition to this active listening, the director at this stage of the process may at times need to suggest something of a wide range of feelings that we might be experiencing to help us put our finger precisely on what that is. But after we've moved from reflecting on our lives to getting in touch with our emotions and naming what they are and expressing them to the director may say, well, you have expressed this to me, but have you expressed these feelings, these emotions and thoughts to God? Encourage the person to do so. And from the reflective dimension to the affective dimension, we then move to the dimension of our needs. As the process of spiritual direction continues, we are called to get in touch with not only our feelings, but also our needs. It is difficult to bring them to God, however, if we do not know what they are. And at this point, the director should encourage the directee to name and identify whatever needs he or she is experiencing at the moment, on whatever level of our human makeup, the physical, the emotional, the intellectual, the spiritual, the social. To name them and identify them, to give them to God. And eventually, we're to find that on the deepest level, our need for God will eventually come and rise up in our awareness. Moving from that to the identification of needs, we then move to an even deeper level of deciding the next step. What is the Lord asking me to do? Having reflected on my life, having explored my affective feelings and emotions, having identified my needs and presenting them to God, what is God asking me to do? And at this point, what's important is not to have some very, very grandiose scheme for something very, very abstract that would be possibly very difficult to implement. But what is needed is to identify something very, very concrete, some practical step that will help you walk closer toward your God. And of course, as this discernment process comes about, the director encourages the person not to make very, very general resolutions, but very, very concrete decisions, demanding that we have little hope of ever putting very, very general resolutions into practice. And once the resolution phase has come to an end, we end in silence. Another minute or two, minute or three in quiet, recognizing the holy conversation that has just taken place and asking God, thanking God for the light we have received, thanking Him and asking Him for the grace to help us implement what we said we would do, and ask for the grace of perseverance. To conclude, spiritual direction involves a relationship of giving and receiving that focuses on enabling us to delve more deeply into the mystery of God and to understand more clearly the ramifications of that experience in the concrete circumstances of our daily lives. And let us conclude with some reflection questions. If asked, how would you describe what spiritual direction is and how it differs from other helping relationships, such as counseling and therapy? How would you describe it? What is the purpose of spiritual direction? What is the job of the spiritual director? In what sense is spiritual direction a process? Why is silence so important in spiritual direction?